He's a federal member for Richmond, which covers some of the worst flood-affected areas, including Ballina and Murwillumbah. So a couple of different issues here. First of all, this overall floods package, we'll see what happens. It's a bit sort of murky what's going on, but the fact this amount is being spoken about, does that encourage you that there'll be plenty of help for the area?
Oh, look, no, Tom, I don't have any faith in the federal or state governments when it comes to our flooding crisis. We essentially have a major humanitarian crisis here on the North Coast. We have thousands that are homeless. We have people with no food, no cash. It is absolutely devastating, the extent of this flood catastrophe. And the fact is, both levels of government have just failed to plan and failed to act and failed to deliver. And just last week, we had a real kick in the guts when Scott Morrison announced some extra disaster payments for those people south of us. And yet we missed out. It was so incredibly unfair. So people in my region had access to that $1,000 disaster relief payment, but not the two extra payments they got down south. And I can tell you that people in my community were absolutely offended and disgusted by that. These are people that have no food. They desperately need this money, and I have been consistently calling upon the Prime Minister to act. Quite frankly, it's disgusting, and he has really failed the people of the far North Coast with his absolute incompetence when it comes to this flooding catastrophe.
So, yeah, as you mentioned, they did get the initial payment. They didn't get the extra ones. What have you been told by the federal government about the fact there wasn't qualification in your area for the extra payments? What specifically have you been told?
Look, all I've heard is a series of lies from both the Prime Minister and his Emergency Services Minister. The fact is the Prime Minister could sign the piece of paper today to deliver that extra funding to this region. He could have signed it yesterday or the day before that, but he hasn't. This is just the height of incompetence from this Prime Minister. He has treated this community with such disrespect. People in their most desperate need have to have access to this funding, and quite frankly, it's offensive and disgusting.
Okay, but in terms of what you've actually been told, you say you've been told lies. That's what you'd decipher them as being. But I'm just asking what you've been told, either publicly or privately, in terms of why the payment hasn't been extended to some of your areas.
Look, Tom, all we hear from the Prime Minister down is all of this talk about, oh, we have to get more evidence about it. Now, I'm saying that's a lie because it is a lie. The Prime Minister has the capacity to sign the piece of paper to get this extra disaster relief funding here. Now remember, the Prime Minister changed all the rules in terms of flooding disasters and cutting red tape, he said. Well, we were declared a disaster here, therefore he can sign the piece of paper, therefore he's lying when he says some other process has to be gone through. This has been delayed day after day, and we have had enough up here. In fact, we even saw last night a Liberal MP resign in absolute disgust over the Prime Minister's inaction over this issue.
Right, but you mentioned declared a disaster. That's why the initial $1,000 is provided to people affected in your area. So the extra two isn't. Again, as to what you're being told, are you being told that maybe Lismore's worse and that's why they get the extra payments? Is that being put to you?
Well, they keep claiming day after day that they're having to put more evidence together, and what I've said to them is that's not the case. It's the Prime Minister's own rules that he is actually able to do it. So why is it taking him so long? He has the capacity to sign the paper today. So it's either that he's playing political games and putting his own political self-interest first, or he's completely incompetent, or a combination of both. He has the capacity to do it, and he is lying to us by giving a series of excuses. And we have had enough. It's been more than a week now since he announced that extra funding for those southern areas.
We'll hear from him later today. We'll see what he might have to say. Let me ask you about the comments from the new head of Infrastructure Australia, that we really need to rethink, and this continues a conversation that's been started, but rethink where we're rebuilding, how we're rebuilding, considering we have a different situation seemingly when it comes to flooding. Is that a fair enough conversation? Is that one Labor would drive federally if it gets into power?
Look, obviously, first and foremost, we're still dealing with the tragedy of people who've lost their homes and making sure that they're safe. And obviously, we're looking then to recovery and rebuilding. We were really offended, of course, by Shane Stone's comments. I mean, it's offensive to have someone who's the head of a resilience disaster federal body making outrageous comments about us, saying we shouldn't live here. Again, he should be sacked for those comments. When we look to the future, we look to rebuilding, we need to see a lot more funding and support here on the ground from both levels of government, remembering it's individuals, households, and also businesses that have been impacted. Our small businesses are the backbone of our local economy. They need a lot of support as well. We need to have a focus on rebuilding.
But don't we also need to have that conversation? So there are people right now that in the next few weeks are turning their mind before the election will be run and won as to what should they do. They're looking for direction. Are they going to rebuild again? So isn't that a conversation that should be had at a really high level strategic sense as to what we're doing in the rebuild and where perhaps we shouldn't be rebuilding?
Oh, look, of course, and these are all things that we need to be looking at. I know for the people in my community, they want to remain here, that they love it here. We have had many floods, not one as bad as this one, but these are conversations people are having. But obviously they do want to stay here. It's our home, it's our community. And I completely agree with you. These are conversations we should be having at all levels of government. And one of the other issues here that's important to bring up is New South Wales government has no emergency disaster planning, as they do say in Queensland. So their response was just too little too late. If we had that in place, we'd have all levels of government involved in the conversation about not just the actual response in terms of rescuing people, getting them housing and getting them food, but also a further conversation about rebuilding. I totally agree it's a conversation that we need to be having, involving everyone as to how we rebuild effectively, given the impact of flood. We also, of course, need to take into account that the government had that $4.8 billion fund in terms of providing emergency assistance for mitigation and so forth. They just haven't spent. And that's an important issue to keep bringing up. Another failure by the Morrison government.
We'll have to leave it there. Justine Elliot, thanks for your time today.